to the Red Leaf Card, your home for Canadian soccer news and views. My name is Jacob, and today we're going to be talking about the Cavalry FC match against Pumas and also Kelowna, Windsor being the front runners for the expansion teams, and CPL deciding to have an Eastern Western Conference season for the future. But first, here's your fixtures rundown. CPL drawed with Chivas in the first leg at 1 apiece. Real Hope gets defeated by Cruz Azul 0-2. Real Esteli makes a big win with Tigres 1-0. So now going into the Canadian Premier League, playing in the CONCACAF Champions Cup, Forge FC loses to CF Monterrey 2-0 in the first leg. But Cavalry FC making a big shocker and history for the Canadian Premier League books. The first Canadian Premier League team winning their first match in the CONCACAF Champions Cup. This is their first win ever for the Canadian Premier League, and Cavalry FC gets a lot of credit of defeating one of the big named Liga MX teams, is Pumas. So final score 2-1, but still they have one more leg to go, and it's going to be in Mexico. And when I saw the match of Cavalry FC, it was probably in the first match, the first half. A lot of people would say, "Oh, Pumas probably have taken Cavalry FC and to make it into a situation that they might not come back." But Cavalry FC didn't hold back and made it to come back. One of the biggest matches that we might see in the history books for Canadian Premier League and also in Canada soccer. And so now leg 2 will be coming in soon, and Cavalry FC probably would have to be in the defensive to this point, that they have to take this lead in the aggregate and probably would have to get some goals in and not make Pumas get some goals in for to come back. But as known, if Cavalry FC does not make any goals in the second leg and Pumas scores 1 goal, Pumas moves on to the next round due to away goals. That's the advantage that Pumas has. If they score any away goals, they move on to the next round. And a lot of fans don't like this kind of rule per se, but it's part of the rules for example, in Europe or any competition in other continents. And you would say if Cavalry FC, if this final score is 1-2 per se, they go to, you would say, PKs or to extra time in this round. But hoping Cavalry FC does really well. But I would say this, if we're talking about Forge FC, Monterrey has been doing really well. They're really competitive in these continent cups. And you would say, can Forge FC come back. And that's something that a lot of fans would ask those questions, and or you would say answer. And I probably would I think it might be over, or if there is some hope for Forge FC to get some goals into the next leg, into the second leg, probably could be 1 goal or 2 goals if Monterrey does not score any goals. If Monterrey scores 1 goal, I'd probably would be over for Forge FC, but it does lead to questions for Forge FC. But I think Forge FC right now, for the upcoming season for the Canadian Premier League, they do really well. I think they are really competitive. They're going to be really competitive alongside with Cavalry FC for the upcoming season. But it leads to questions if they can handle against the other teams out there. So a lot of things will happen in the future for some teams out there, but there's been some rumors or sources coming out from other journalists out there, like for example, like Josh Healy, who from the Wanderers Notes, giving out sources about who will be the runner-ups for the expansion teams for the 2026 season. And Kelowna and Windsor are the front runner because it's been questions out there. They are sometimes releasing what the sources are, where they're going to be playing, and also Kelowna, because they've been basically marketed for the best suitable BC team, and there's been some news out there, possible expansion. But there's other cities out there that want to be part of the expansion market for Canadian Premier League. For example, Kingston was one of those cities. There's a lot of them. For example, Mississauga, possibility, but we don't know yet, since the city of Mississauga has not passed a vote to make a stadium in Mississauga. And a lot of people would misinform about Mississauga being part of the list because there's been sources coming out. But the matter of fact is, it would be better if to wait until that the city of Mississauga passes the vote of building the stadium for Mississauga. And it always sometimes gets to that hype of, hey, fans that love soccer in Mississauga, they're building a stadium. But matter of fact is, they didn't pass it yet. We're still waiting on it. And this whole hype for that they're giving out, that they're building a stadium, it leads to questions from the citizens in Mississauga that when is it going to happen? Oh, until they pass the vote, until it's unanimous for the city of Mississauga to agree with it. And you're not going to get so many positives from people hearing that they have to wait. But sooner or later, a few more months, you would say that they're going to do it to pass this motion. And when they hear that it passes, now that's the point to build a stadium and try to find any investors that they want to run an Canadian Premier League team, or use it for some purpose for citizens to play some soccer matches there, or probably League One Ontario teams getting to play there, and moves on and forth. It's a big problem having it in Mississauga at this time. And now, even for example, a lot of fans criticizing the Canadian Premier League, not hearing anything about Quebec teams being part of the front runners for the expansion teams. A lot of criticism. Yeah, and what can you say? There's no sources anywhere. There's never been any news that any Quebec teams would speak out, or Quebecan or any investors, because they know that the contract that they sign to invest that is that they have to keep it silent, and then later have some of these journalists would have to bring in some rumors or sources that there's going to be an expansion team in Quebec, but you're not seeing any good sources coming out that there was investors for a Quebec team. What we've always been heard that in the University of Laval stadium, that they had investors coming in, that they would be interested in having a team for the Canadian Premier League play there. Or, for example, CS Saint Laurent was always been targeted to be a Canadian Premier League team. But here's the problem. The owners of CS Saint Laurent have never had any ties of talking with the Canadian Premier League or the commissioner, or the reason why they don't have the funds or the money to be an expansion team to the Canadian Premier League. And it's going to be costing a lot of money to build a stadium or any other things. That's a problem. So there's a lot of problems we're seeing from the Canadian Premier League side of expansion talks. I know a lot of people who would say maybe Windsor, but a lot of people would say Edmonton to being an expansion team to bring it back. But people in Edmonton would say it's not a good idea to have a team in Edmonton, since how the fan base is not there, the ownership would not be really well, or probably it's better off that you find an ownership to have a team in Edmonton to actually be more marketable to the fans who love the sports. And we're not seeing from FC Edmonton fans that used to be fans of it, and it really went downhill. It went downhill to that part, and some of the FC Edmontons would say, well, mostly it's because of weather issues to that point, and that's the reason why FC Edmonton fans don't go to games, because usually Edmonton has like a weather problem, like it rains a lot, or any other things, but it loses more fans at this point. And that's really a question some Edmonton fans would want to say. Are they really interested in having an expansion team, or they're not interested anymore, but just leads to them at this point? If they want to see a new ownership that has its true identity, that loves to be in Edmonton, and so forth and on. And looking at if that two teams get expanded to the Canadian Premier League, which I mentioned Kelowna and Windsor. If those are the two expansion teams coming in for 2026, possibility that the Canadian Premier League could go for Eastern and Western Conference at this point. And we're probably going to have mixed feelings about the Canadian Premier League moving into this Major League Soccer knockoff. And a lot of fans don't like to being that point of being that Major League Soccer 2.0, and having to move as the Eastern Western Conference. It really doesn't make sense at the point that you're going to expand with 10 teams, and it really leads to questions. It leads to questions. What really made the ideal to have an Eastern and Western Conference in the Canadian Premier League with only managing with 10 teams at this point? In my opinion, that if you want an Eastern Western Conference in the Canadian Premier League, probably wait until you get 16 teams in the Canadian Premier League, or you have in total 20 teams, or you would say 20 or 22 teams. I remember League One Ontario used to have the Eastern Western Conference, and then later they ditched it and decided we have 22 teams right now. We're going to this motion that we want to have promotion relegation in League One Ontario. And probably we might see that in the Canadian Premier League when they reach 22 teams, or probably 20 teams. I don't know if that Mark Noonan wants that to be a solution, if they want to have this Eastern Western Conference in there. But in total, if they have 20 teams or 22, probably make the ideal to have a promotion relegation system and establish a second division league. And some fans would say probably no at that point when they have 20 teams and they have the Eastern and Western Conference. And it leads to the situation, what's going to happen in the future? And it does lead to questions that some fans would look at this Canadian Premier League. If there's an Eastern and Western Conference, it leads to thinking it's Major League Soccer 2.0. We're rooting like Toronto FC. We're rooting for Vancouver Whitecaps at this point. And it leads to probably a downfall for the market of the Canadian Premier League if it leads to that situation. And I'm not going to brag about this, but there's a lot of problems happening in Major League Soccer right now. For example, Vancouver Whitecaps, that they're trying to find a new ownership. And you look at Toronto FC right now, how their performances, and even Club de Foot Montreal, of their ownership. And again, it leads to that problem. If being Major League Soccer 2.0 to have an Eastern and Western Conference, how is the Canadian Premier League going to actually gain expansion teams at that point? If we have this Eastern and Western Conference and you're going to have this playoff have a playoff format. How is the playoff format going to look like to that point? If like, let's just say if it's, we have 5 teams right now in the West, we have 5 teams in the East. So probably you would have to start with 2 teams qualifying to the playoffs. So you would have to say 2 teams in the Eastern Conference would qualify to the playoffs, and 2 teams from the West qualifying to the playoffs. That's really would look like of this whole thing. But you're going to make a lot of changes to the playoff format, and a lot of the teams that are going to probably look at this saying, you're probably giving a lot of advantage to some of the teams out there, and you're looking at one of the biggest teams in the Canadian Premier League who has that big advantage. You have Cavalry FC, you have Forge FC, and probably you're going to look at some of the teams out there in the Canadian Premier League, probably Halifax Wanderers, you're going to look at York United, you're going to look at all these teams like Valor FC, for example. You're going to look at them, the possibilities that they're not going to even make the playoffs if this happens. You're going to look at Vancouver FC. Probably had the chance to make it to the playoffs, but probably gets the point that they're going to have the odds of not making the playoffs. And it leads to that point that having 10 teams and changing it to an Eastern and Western Conference for the league of the Canadian Premier League, it does not make sense anymore. And you have to make a system that makes sense for fans that are on board, that love it, and they don't want to see that point that teams are not going to have the odds of making the playoffs at the point if you're going to put it in. And I think that Valor FC had a chance for that 2024 season. Vancouver FC had that chance to being in the 2024 season. But right now, you're looking at, if we see this happen in 2026 or the upcoming years after 2026, it's not going to go good. So not having the conferences works for the Canadian Premier League, and move on and continue on adding more Canadian teams to try to make it ideal to have a promotion relegation system and establish a second division league works better for the future for Canadian Premier League and for the fans. But a lot of fans do have this, they are pro and they're not to this point. And a lot of fans would see what's happening in League One Ontario. Probably it will spark some fans that it does bring in some competition, and we'll see how that future goes for Canada Soccer in Canadian Premier League, how it goes. And that's full time of the Red Leaf Herd. You could follow us on YouTube, Spotify, and X. I'm your host, Jacob, subbing out.